Hello, I'm Lynn Albizo, Vice President of Public Policy for the Immune Deficiency Foundation, and would like to welcome you to the session, Swimming Upstream, Addressing Payer Challenges and Ensuring Access to Genetic Testing. Our presenters today are Dr. Manish Butte and Abraham Yunis. Dr. Butte is the E. Richard Stame Endowed Chair and Professor of the Department of Pediatrics at UCLA and Division Chief of Immunology, Allergy, and Rheumatology. He also has a joint appointment in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. Abraham Yunis is IDF's new Director of Payer Relations and Policy, with extensive experience working on payer issues with specialty pharmacies and payers, including positions with CVS Specialty, Optum Health, and United Health Group. At this time, please join me in welcoming our presenters, Dr. Manish Butte and Abraham Yunis. Dr. Butte, if you want to share your screen, we can get started.
Great. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. And I look forward to starting a conversation about payers and genetic testing, because it's something that is on my mind virtually every day that we try to practice immunology. And I'm going to try to take 10 minutes here to explain why we do genetic testing, what it's for, and the struggles that we face. And I'm going to try to present a couple of the major challenges that we're facing along the way, and hopefully get all of you riled up so we can solve this problem. So when we talk about genetic testing, we're talking about test sequencing parts of the genome. The genome makes up about 6 billion bases, A, C, T, G, the instruction book for how our cells work. And different parts of the genome collect information called genes. And those genes tell my immune cells how to fight infections, my heart cells how to beat, my eye cells how to process light and turn it into images. So these are the instructions for how our body works. And the part of the genome that codes for proteins, the proteins are really the parts that the cells use to do things, makes up only about 2% of the genome. We used to call the rest of this genome, the rest of the 98% junk DNA. It's not really junk. It kind of regulates which parts of the genes turn on at which times. You wouldn't want your heart cell genes turning on in your immune cells, and you don't want your immune cells to start acting like your heart or your lungs or your liver. So the regulation of which genes turn on at which time is controlled by all of this other part. And then another thing that you'll hear a lot about nowadays are what are called gene panels. Gene panels are exome sequencing, but done on a small number of genes. Instead of all 20,000 genes in our genome, instead it's only about 400 of the genes related to inborn errors of immunity, what we nowadays call primary immune deficiencies, we're now calling inborn errors of immunity. Notably, there's yet another smaller chunk of the genome that you can take, which is called genotyping. About 1 million bases of the 6 billion bases are tested this way. This is what 23andMe does, or Ancestry.com. This is not at all interesting for rare diseases. It is not the least bit useful for clinical work. And I don't recommend people waste $100 for this unless you're interested in entertainment or ancestry. Okay, so why do we do genetic testing? Let's get right to the punchline. First and foremost, it ends the diagnostic odyssey. A lot of our patients go years and years without knowing what's wrong with them or their kids. Why are they sick all the time? Why do they have these weird fevers? Why are they getting these strange infections or autoimmunity? The sense of relief that our patients have upon getting a genetic diagnosis to end their odyssey is palpable. And it also helps avoid unnecessary testing. A lot of our patients go years and years and years seeing hematologists and pulmonologists and GI doctors, getting endoscopies and other procedures that may be unnecessary as we head towards a genetic diagnosis, that we can say, these are the tests that are needed from this point onward. These are the treatments that are needed from this point onward. In fact, we know that the testing, the amount of test dollars spent on testing goes way down once a diagnosis is made. It also gives you an ace card to play against your payer. Many of the payers out there, Anthems, Blue Crosses out there, are not interested in paying for the therapies that you need for your immune deficiencies. And by playing them this card and saying, this is the genetic disease I have, this is the molecular basis for why my body is going wrong and why it's going against me, it's very hard for those companies to refute. It allows for family planning, of course, and genetic counseling, especially if new children are trying to be made through in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, a chance to make a baby that doesn't have a genetic disease, or to understand the implications of cousins and siblings and aunts and uncles who may have a similar phenotype. And finally, and I'll talk a little bit about this now, is this idea that we can target new therapies to patients specifically because of their genetics. The best example of this is in babies with SCID. There's now a handful of SCID babies that we can treat with a special type of bone marrow transplant called gene therapy, where their own stem cells are taken out, the gene is repaired and put back in the body, and then they're cured. That kind of gene therapy is happening for new genes all the time, and it is not possible if you don't know what gene you're repairing. And then, of course, and I'll mention to you a little bit, there are specific inhibitors that we can use for autoimmunity or inflammation that our PID patients have that is targeted to their molecule. Instead of just putting everyone on steroids and saying, let's see how it goes, instead we could pick a specific inhibitor. And I'll get into some of that in a little bit. So who pays for exome sequencing? This is the first and major challenge. Nobody pays for exome sequencing. Nobody pays for genetic testing right now. If you want to get exome sequencing through Medicare, forget about it. Every single insurance company out, every single sequencing company out there requires what's called an advanced beneficiary notice of non-coverage, or an ABN. It's basically asking you to understand that no one's going to pay for this. Medicare is not going to pay for this. You got to pay for this. Medicaid, forget about it. Medicaid in California certainly does not pay for genetic testing. Even the specialized branch of Medicaid for the most complex children called California Children's Services, or CCS, doesn't pay for genetic testing. Forget about it. Cigna, United Healthcare, they typically will say, hey, we won't cover this, but we're happy to hear your appeal. And then they'll do a denial, and then you'll do another appeal. Then you go to a peer-to-peer, and then you'll get a denial, and then you'll get a denial, and then it'll be over. And Anthem will give you an extra bit of runaround because they hire a company to be the frontline round of appeals before you get to talk to the Anthem people. And then they'll lie to you about that, and you'll start all over again, and then you'll eventually get a denial. There's no answer here. And this is a very depressing part of my week, is that we need to do genetic testing to make diagnoses in our patients, and yet we can't get anyone to pay for it. One workaround that we have figured out is that we can admit patients to the hospital, because if they're admitted to the hospital, the payer pays for the hospitalization, and the diagnostic testing that goes along with it, like exome sequencing or whatever, can come along for the ride. That is not a very good solution, and it really puts a big inconvenience on our patients. This is what the rejection letters look like. We will not cover this service because it's experimental or investigational. They don't have any idea. They're not the least bit interested in understanding why it's experimental, why it isn't experimental, why it isn't investigational. And I spend hours per week now, every week, trying to fight and explain to payers and their, the retired geriatricians that they hire to review these insurance claims to tell them about genetic testing and why we need to do this in our PID patients. Payers absolutely need to do better. They need to do better for our rare diseases and for every set of rare diseases out there. They are universally reviled by our patients because they do not focus on rare diseases. And there's a good reason for it. They're for-profit companies, and they know that most of our patients will switch insurance companies every 18 months. And so if they just drag their feet for a few months, they're less likely to have to pay for anything. It's a very frustrating part of our patients' existence and us too. What is the problem of these insurance companies? Why aren't they paying for this testing? I'm going to give you some of the questions they ask us, just so you can understand the things that we have to tell them. For example, Blue Cross says a specific mutation has to be identified. Well, we have 500 genes that are with specific mutations in them that lead to inborn errors of immunity. Okay, so we easily meet this criteria for our patients. The second thing that we get challenged with all the time is that the genetic disorder can't be identified by some other method of testing. For example, most of our patients out here on these calls have CVID phenotype and antibody deficiency. We can certainly identify the phenotype, the defect in the ability of B cells to make antibody responses from biochemical and immunological testing. But we cannot identify the specific genetic disorder that these CVID patients have, which means we can't pick those targeted therapies. The genetic disorder has to be associated with a potentially significant disability or have a natural lethal history. This is unfortunately an important point that PID patients meet. This is a graph from Charlotte Cunningham-Rundle's now almost 10 years ago, where she showed that patients who have CVID phenotype and also have some degree of autoimmunity or immune dysregulation have a much lower survival than those patients who have infections only or who compared to the baseline individuals up here. These patients may have a shorter lifespan by 10, 20, 30 years. So this certainly, our disorders certainly meet the criteria needed that there are significant disabilities to be faced, but without the diagnosis. The next criteria, the hurdle that we face all the time to help insurance companies understand why we do this, is that the test has to have clinical impact. It has to be actionable. That's the word that they use for us. There has to be a predictive, diagnostic, therapeutic impact as doing the test. Jordan Orange and his colleagues, Asberg Stray-Peterson, published a paper now 4 or 5 years ago, where they actually directly tackled this question. They showed that in what they, at that time they're calling the Houston Project, where they're sequencing patients in Texas, they showed that there was a impact and actionability due to making a genetic diagnosis in over a third of the patients. Here are some of the actionability points that I use to describe to our patients and to insurance payers. When we see patients who have a type of CVID driven by STAT1 gain of function, then we can use JAK inhibitors. This is an off-label use of a drug, but it specifically slows down the tempo of their autoimmune disease. For our patients who have NLRP3 gain of function, lots of inflammation in their tissues, and sometimes antibody or other immune deficiencies and infections, we can use IL-1 blockers like anakinra or canakinumab. These may be on label if it's NLRP3 or off label if it's other inflammasomopathies. And we have to be able to explain the molecular pathways to the insurance companies. If they accept it, then this is really excellent actionability to slow down the trajectory of their disease. Interferonopathies, we can use JAK inhibitors. CTLA4 and LRBA deficiencies, very important causes of CVID phenotype. There's a specific molecule called abatacept that can be used to slow down the autoimmunity and the inflammation. Bone marrow transplants can be suggested for patients who have combined immune deficiencies with certain actionable genetic diagnoses, even gene therapy, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And then there are lots and lots of even more experimental therapies. I'll give you an example here. This is a little 4-year-old boy who we diagnosed with an immune deficiency who had severe disseminated fungal infection. This fungus that lives in California, Arizona, and parts of West Texas and Southern Nevada, called coccidioidomycosis or valley fever. This kind of fungus, if it spreads out of your lungs, destroys the body. In this case, it was spreading through his skull and through his spinal cord. He was certainly not going to survive despite aggressive ICU level care and antifungal medicines. We diagnosed him with an immune deficiency. We treated him with an experimental idea of blocking his allergic immune system, the Th2 immune system, blocking the IL-4 and IL-13 cytokines, and we were able to cure him. His lesions all melted away over the course of a few weeks, and he's now 2 years later. This kind of idea that you can pick therapies that are molecularly targeted to the genes, to the defect that the patients have, can't be done if we don't do genetic testing. The insurance companies tell us that there has to be a likelihood of anticipated improvement. Of course, we know that in inborn errors of immunity, that if we can block some of these autoimmune and inflammatory consequences that patients have, that they'll have fewer hospitalizations, and the Models have shown in one of their papers that the overall cost goes down. And of course, they want to have some testing accompanied by genetic counseling. This turns out to be a major hurdle for some of our colleagues out in the field, in the community. They don't have genetic counselors working in their clinics. We're lucky at UCLA and other major academic medical centers have access to genetic counselors who help us with this hurdle, who write letters for us. It's extra work that we have to go through to convince these the anthems out there that we know what we're doing, that we have genetic counselors helping us. But it's a barrier for all the doctors out there, all the immunologists out there in the community trying to solve the problems without this extra help. Who needs genetic testing? As I mentioned, the benefits from the beginning are very clear. We think everyone with a primary immune deficiency or inborn error of immunity deserves genetic testing. You have a genetic disease, you deserve a genetic diagnosis, period. But certainly some families, like when there's consanguinity, when there are unusually severe phenotypes, or when there's autoimmunity attached onto immune deficiency, we think these situations certainly merit aggressive genetic diagnosis right at from the very first clinic visit. Now, what's important to remember that when we do genetic testing, we have millions of variants in our genome. Variants are the parts of our genome that differ from the reference person out there. There's one person's genome out there that we compare our genomes and our patients' genomes to, that one person's genome. And they vary. Of course, we're not all genetically identical twins. We vary from each other. My hair color, my skin color, my height, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of genes in mine that I vary from the reference genome. We have 20,000 genes and 5 million variants on average. These variants are mostly benign. They don't change the biology. They don't create disease. They may change my skin color. There's about 154 genes that regulate my skin color and your skin color. If the variant is this way or that way, if the gene is a T or an A or a C or a G, it's not going to create a disease state. It just may change my skin color compared to yours. All of those variants we call benign. And then there are variants that are clearly pathogenic, like the cystic fibrosis gene. If you break that gene, and the patient gets cystic fibrosis, we know about 80% of patients with cystic fibrosis have one particular mutation, a deletion, and we know that that deletion is pathogenic. And so if you find that variant in a patient's genome, you can say that variant is pathogenic, okay? And then there's everything in between. And these are called variants of unknown significance. And this is the second grand challenge we face as we move into genetic testing for our patients, is to understand the impacts of these variants of unknown significance. We have to take each variant and think about what the impact on each gene, and it's a lot of work. And not all centers are capable of doing this. This is largely reserved for large academic medical centers at this point. The other major challenge is that exomes only explain about 30 to 50% of our immune deficiencies. And that's just because we don't know that much about all the genes that cause immune deficiencies yet. In fact, if you look at this graph, the number of genes that we're discovering that lead to immune deficiencies is going up by about 40 genes a year. That's more than 3 or 4 a month. Last month, there were a couple amazing papers for new genetic disorders. We are learning so fast. And that's why we tell patients to reanalyze their exomes every 6 to 12 months, see if what was unknown 6 months ago is now known. The data are sitting there. Just grab it and see if we can reanalyze it. Getting that paid for, by the way, is extraordinarily difficult. I have submitted to various insurance companies over the last year reanalysis billing codes, and almost to the one, they are not paid for. And then think about new genes. There's obviously new genes being discovered continuously. Our group just published a new gene for SCID that we discovered, that we helped discover. And there are new genes, as I mentioned, being discovered all the time. But this is another one of our grand challenges. How do we move beyond gene panels and exome sequencing into really making more diagnoses? We're not satisfied with 50%. We want to solve all these immune deficiencies. And what at UCLA we've started to do is whole genome sequencing and RNA sequencing. These are more advanced sequencing capabilities. And we've been doing this for about 6 years here. And we've learned how to interpret some very difficult cases and solve them by employing these more advanced tools. So the take-home points here is that immune deficiencies are caused by genetic variants in our genome. That's what IEIs are. They are genetic diseases. And everyone with a genetic disease deserves a genetic diagnosis, period. Now, we have to find rare variants, and they have to be pathogenic. And most of the problem is that we have these genes that have variants that we don't know what they do. And how to capture that middle ground and understand the impact of these variants is still a challenge for all of us. You can't just look at a patient with an inborn nerve immunity and say, this is the likely gene. Those days of one gene, one phenotype are over. We have so many hundreds of genes now with overlapping clinical phenotypes that you really have to think about doing genetic testing for everyone. And remember that once you have that genetic test, you can come up with new treatments. I gave you some examples earlier. These are critical for helping patients not suffer from the consequences of their autoimmunity and inflammation. Tried to capture all that in a few minutes here. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. And again, thank you so much for listening. And I hope we can help move these balls forward as patients face more and more opportunities to get genetic testing, but also significant hurdles.
Thank you, Dr. Butte. Now we're going to go over to Abe, and he'll do his presentation, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So go ahead, Abe Yunis from the Immune Deficiency Foundation will now present.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Dr. Butte, as well for all of that information. It's actually extremely helpful and very encouraging, although probably quite painful to deal with all the pair-related matters. But it's very encouraging to see that providers such as yourself are aware of some of the constraints that we are facing especially when it comes to the testing of genetics to identify diseases or hereditary conditions. So thank you very much for that. I myself, so again, my name is Abraham Yunis, and I am new to the foundation. I worked with specialty pharmacies for 6.5 years, and then with insurance for another 6.5 or so years. And the last of my experience was actually at a local San Diego lab where they did the testing of genetics to detect melanoma. And that was quite an experience. Just to sort of get the conversation going, I think from all the research that I have done, genetic profiling and the understanding of genetic sequencing didn't really take off until the 1980s. And so this company is very much a startup company, and we are in 2020. So so it's very much a new science. And as many people know, PI conditions are usually inherited. They are inherited either from one parent or from both. And the genetic code and the understanding of it and being able to identify it gives us an understanding of what that PI condition is, of what we are dealing with. A lot of forms of PI go unnoticed for many years, and which we'll talk about a little bit more, which causes a lot of times a strain for insurances on the from a utilization perspective. So if we're able to identify things for children or for babies, we are able to very early on I identify these complicated conditions, which are all extremely similar, and we would be able to also reduce the utilization of not identifying it till years and years later, maybe after some complications. And so some of the things that we are seeing as far as challenges go is because genomics is such a new technology, all of these insurance companies, or many of them, as Dr. Butte mentioned, are denying claims and are not wanting to pay for a benefit that a lot of PI, people with PI need. And it is in many ways the most straightforward way to identify what a person has, rather than running many exams. So it's not really adopted by insurances yet. And I think that's because it's very much new. Also, one thing that we are seeing that a lot of the insurances have been doing, as they have done on the pharmaceutical side, is they assign genetic testing or laboratory coverage to a third party, to a company that then acts as a laboratory benefit manager. And so these third companies are pretty much almost insurance companies on their own, as far as their own policies and what tests they cover and what they don't. So there are always new policies coming out. And imagine how many policies you would need when we have more than 400 different PIs. And so a lot of the things that we are doing on behalf of the foundation, and part of why I am actually here, especially on the payer side of things, is to act as a liaison and to enhance the communication between providers, patients, payers, specialty pharmacies, laboratory benefit management companies, pharmacy benefit management companies, to really enhance that communication so that they can also gain the understanding that, in fact, when identifying genetic conditions early, believe it or not, it does usually yield to lower utilization. So it is actually something that has been proven, and we will continue to promote the coverage of it, with any policies that we identify, whether it's through a third party or directly through a payer, whether it's Anthem or any of the insurances. We will look to collaborate with them, to work with them on this mutual understanding, and to just develop that communication. Because I do believe that there are a lot of silos. Dr. Butte, he mentioned he spends 10 hours of his week just on this kind of education. So we need to first have a better understanding of the existing policies that are already out there, but also we need to promote coverage for this new science, which now I feel like we are at a point where it really shouldn't be even considered a new science. It should be almost considered like the electric vehicle, very quick adoption of which, because we are seeing, a lot of benefit in just identifying these things early. So, our main priority in this as well is, after collaborating with the insurances and reaching an agreement, is to relay that information to patients and to providers so that they can understand when do things require, for example, a prior authorization, what is covered and what is not, and what can we do together to hopefully expand that coverage. One of the things that we are working, as part of our initiatives, is we are actually working with an external consulting group, and we are bringing together people from these different specialties, if you would, in the industry, so that we can have this kind of conversation, so that we can talk about the existing policies. Why are they written that way? What do people in the field, such as Dr. Butte, have as far as real live data that we can provide them with, that could hopefully introduce newer policies that would cover the 400 plus conditions that are out there for PI. So currently we are developing an outreach plan, and that outreach plan is for all types of insurances, really, PBMs, medical insurances, and also laboratory benefit management companies as well. We will be looking to provide them with the latest information from the challenges that are faced by providers like Dr. Butte, and from the community, the PI community that we hear from directly through, for example, Ask IDF. And we want to provide them with a reference page for the main insurance companies. There are some larger national insurance providers like United Health Group and Cigna, for example. And so we want to create a robust reference on our site where anyone, a patient, a family of, can go to our website and be able to know exactly, okay, if I have United, this is what I need. This is what I need to do. This is what is available out there. And we will continue to work on, that type of education, for patients on the insurance coverage that is available, and just try to offer as many helpful online tools as we possibly can. So a lot of the opportunities that we are seeing out there, the number of conditions is obviously increasing. So we are putting focus on understanding diagnosis codes, even understanding if a new diagnosis code needs to be introduced, because it's a PI that is now has a new name, and we need to document it, and it needs a code. We're even looking into that and CDC guidelines surrounding that. We are looking to better define the medical and pharmaceutical coverage per plan. Sometimes things fall under Medicare Part D, which is the pharmaceutical side. Sometimes they fall under Medicare Part B, like boy. And so that could be very complicated, believe it or not. Coming from the insurance world, I've even seen Medicare sort of deal with that confusion on their side, even trying to understand where should this go. So it's a continuous conversation. I think very important things that unfortunately, for someone like me, having come to the foundation, my main focus is helping people. And I know that there's always a business side of things, just like there's a business side to hospitals as well, and things like that. And I know that when it comes to the insurance world, having come from there, there's a lot of focus on hopefully lowering utilization, because it usually increases the quality of care, and it is a financial benefit when it comes to forecasting for a lot of the payers. So as I mentioned early in my introduction, I had worked with a small lab company for melanoma. So it's the same thing, looking at genetic sequences. And they all doors were shut in their face, things like that, up until we showed them through financial forecasting that if you catch things early on, you are actually helping the patient and your bottom line, as well as an insurance provider and as a business. So we want to be able to provide more of that forecasting and the understanding that catching things early is very much beneficial. We want to be able to really have direct points of contact. So if I have a question and it's a patient who utilizes Caremark specialty pharmacy, I want to be able to reach the IGIV team at Caremark. We want to be able to do that. We want to be able to be connectors for that kind of information, and we will shoot to do that on a monthly basis. Before we go into Q&A, I really want to emphasize the importance of genetic testing and genetic counseling and its introduction as a new benefit. There is a lot of both financial and medical benefit and life quality benefit in identifying these things early. And I want to end on this remark as well, is, we live in a world now where if someone needs a brain scan or needs a bone scan, they need an X-ray, a CT scan, and MRI, it is very normal. They're being conducted and they're covered, and that's how we are identifying things a lot of times that are not visible. And genetic sequencing is far from being visible, but it is the same thing. We need to be able to scan for this to be a normalcy and to identify PI conditions very early on. It would enhance the lives of many people, and it would actually benefit the business world as well. And Lynn, I will pass it back to you now, I think, for our Q&A, right? So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. And I'm trying to see if there's any questions coming in. I'll throw one out there. So, Dr. Butte, I recall you mentioned that with Medicare, it's generally not covered. I recall a previous presentation you gave where you said there was some type of genetic testing that is now covered more easily. Could you explain that?
Right. This is the ultimate irony here, is that CMS has listed the genetic sequencing, the exome sequencing codes now, and they have a non-zero reimbursement amount. Until 2019, all the exome sequencing codes had been listed in their tables. And then if you say, 81517, let's see how much we're going to get paid for it, it's zero. And it had been zero for years and years and years. So Medicare would never say, oh, we deny exome sequencing. They say, of course, we allow you to do exome sequencing. Please do whatever is best for our patient. We'll reimburse you exactly as the table says. We're not denying anything. And then they'd give zero. And of course, you can't do testing and multi-$1,000 testing if the reimbursement is zero. So in 2019, they actually started listing real numbers on there, non-zero numbers on the table. And so you think to yourself, wow, Medicare has seen the light. All the other payers will see the light soon too. But the reality is that, whether it's done at an academic center, like you said, or any of the companies, as I said, GeneDx, Ambry, PerkinElmer, all of the big ones that do exome sequencing, all of them require the Medicare patients to fill out this notice. What was it called? What did I call it? The Notice of Advanced Beneficiary Notice, ABN. And that ABN is a document that says, well, we won't say whether we're paying for it yet or not, but you have to acknowledge that you may end up paying for it. Okay, so the patient has to sign something saying we may end up having to pay entirely for this if it doesn't get covered. Almost all of our Medicare patients aren't interested in the multi-$1,000 bill that could show up in their lap and a signature that has their name on it saying, I agree to pay that multi-$1,000 bill. So if Medicare decides not to cover it, and does Medicare cover it? It certainly covers it for our inpatients. And that's the strategy that we've been using for our Medicare patients, is admit them to the hospital, order the exome sequence, send them home, It's a complete waste of money. It is oftentimes we're trying to do it in order to expedite a variety of diagnostic testing, not just the exome sequencing. It's not a great workaround. And I think a better workaround would be for the payers like Medicare to say, we will actually cover this ahead of time. So then Ambry and GeneDx and PerkinElmer and these companies will say, oh yeah, look, Medicare says right on their website, they'll pay for it. We'll do the test for you. Unfortunately, there's still a disconnect, and maybe this is the kind of thing that Abe can help with.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Another question. There are a number of companies now that are offering genetic testing free for, they're basically pushing their product or whatever. Do you have thoughts about that? Is that a good thing? Or obviously we want payers to cover it, but in the meantime,
it'd be great to hear Abe's opinion on this. I would say there's sort of two frees out there. Okay, two ways of thinking about free. One way to think about free is there are certain disorders, like if the PID patient has a phenotype that looks a lot like PI3 kinase gain of function. These disorders are also called activated PI3 kinase disorders, APDS. In this family of genes, PIK3CD and PIK3R1, if there's a deficiency of these that leads to, or overactivation of these, it leads to a certain phenotype. If the patient meets the check boxes of that phenotype, there's actually a company out there that will pay Invitae to do the panel testing, the $250 panel test that they do. They'll make it zero. And so if your patient meets that phenotype, boom, you get a free gene panel. Similarly for WHIM syndrome, there's a company out there that is so interested in getting genetic diagnoses of WHIM syndrome that they will support if the patient meets these phenotypic criteria of having looking like a WHIM syndrome, smelling like a WHIM syndrome, quacking like a WHIM syndrome, flapping like a WHIM syndrome. Then they'll pay for the gene panel to be done at Invitae, which includes 407 genes, but one of them is CXCR4, which is the WHIM syndrome gene, and so you get that for free. Similarly, the Model Foundation has generously offered a variety of centers the ability to do totally free gene panels at Invitae. If you have patients, you meet certain criteria, you just send it to them, they will pay for a bunch of these. So there's free, and that's free. Then there's the other free, which is not that, but where there are new companies, Lynn, as you mentioned, that are starting up and they say, we're going to offer you free genetic testing. Invitae does this too, by the way. They do some of this discount testing. And, you just have to be a little bit careful because some of the, what they're actually getting, these are for-profit companies. They're not charities. The reason that they're doing this is because they're mining your data and your phenotype to create a database to be able to sell to someone else. 23andMe, for example, this is one of their business models, is that they collect so much SNP data and phenotype data. I tend to sleep 4 hours a night. I tend to eat, this kind of food. You fill out that survey, and then they have your SNPs, and they say, look at all this juicy data we have to sell to, companies that want to market to you. So remember that old adage that if you're not paying for something, you are the product. The company is making money on you somehow. And maybe that's not nefarious. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's something terrible, but it is, you just need to be aware of it, that unless somebody you know and love, like the Model Foundation or one of these companies interested in supporting specific PIDs, is actually paying for it, then probably you're paying for it in a different way. Your data are being mined and being sold. Abe, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's that's very much something that I had seen actually, especially when a lot of these newer companies in San Diego, for example, where I am, there's for some reason there's a focus on genomics here specifically, and when something is new, they want people to try it actually. So they do that even on new tests, pre-insurance. And to sort of touch on something that you had said, that Lynn had asked about, I think, is when there's a test that is free. I've seen when something falls under preventative care, usually preventative care is covered at 100%. So if it's one of those that so happens to meet the criteria and fall under preventative care, then that's one situation where it is also free. And obviously, I don't have exact references, nor would I name them, even if I remembered them. But I do believe that in the gathering of data, data is extremely powerful. And, just like I mentioned, when it comes to the financial forecasting model, that's only possible if we have data. Without data, we wouldn't be able to show, things like utilization and things like that for the different conditions. So I do think that data is extremely powerful, to the point where I've seen data being, bought. So it's very important. And so I don't think that anything is completely free. It's very important to always research who's doing what and where, that data lives. But yeah, there are situations where the tests are actually free.
Okay, well, we do have a question from the audience. Is genome testing meaningful for adults in their 60s? What is the benefit to deciphering the genome for older individuals?
Great question. And again, I would refer back to that slide that I offered that said, first of all, ending the with genetic testing and getting an answer, you end this diagnostic odyssey. Many of our older patients have been suffering with inborn errors of immunity for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And for them to then have an answer, why they are sick, what's going on, and more importantly, what that implies about their disease. You belong to a disorder genetically that only affects your B cells and won't affect your T cells. That's interesting. Then the immunoglobulin treatments might be really all I need. Oh, look at this. You have a phenotype that really looks and smells a lot like an antibody deficiency, but your genetics tells us that your T cells are probably also impaired. Maybe you're more like a combined immune deficiency. Let's dig into that a little bit. Maybe that explains that fungal infection you had. Maybe that explains that weird rash that you have. And then you dive into that more, you may realize that they actually have a broader phenotype than they even realized. I can give you examples of a 61-year-old that we take care of who suffered with CVID for many years. He got a round of rituximab to treat his immune-driven platelet disorder, and then his B cells didn't come back for a long time. This is actually a pretty common story for our older adults with CVID and who get rituximab. In his case, we ended up sequencing him. He came to my attention. We sequenced him. We found out that he had a telomere defect. So the chromosomes themselves have enzymes that repair and keep the chromosomes intact and healthy. He had a defect there. That was the cause of his immune deficiency. That also was the cause of why his bone marrow was starting to fail in his older years. It also explained a finding that we didn't even understand at that time, but it totally explained it, was that he had some degree of lung fibrosis going on. His pulmonary function testing was declining, and it showed a restrictive pattern that we were really sort of confused about. That fibrosis that his lungs were developing was also explained by this telomere disease. So the idea that you can actually start to bring together the mystery parts, even of these mystery patients under single genetic headings, is a win for that guy. It really helped solve a lot of his questions. His pulmonologist immediately could start addressing his restrictive disease with interventions, et cetera. So yes, and I can give you lots of examples of 60, 50, 70-year-olds who we've made genetic diagnoses on, and it made a big impact on their life. This is not a test just for babies at all.
So one last question that try to do a quick answer because we're almost at time, but this is from a person said, my genetic testing results for bone marrow failure showed a few genes that had mutations that were labeled, quote, genes of unknown significance. Yeah. What does that mean?
Right. So in the figure that I showed, in the middle of that figure was this thing called variants of unknown significance. That's exactly what you're referring to. That's when a gene that we know about, that we know is sort of important for the immune system, has a mutation or a variant in it, and we don't know what that variant is doing to your gene. It could be something mild, like the example I typically give in clinic is you may have a ding in your car door, right? It's unsightly, it's sort of the paint's chipped off, but your car drives perfectly fine, right? That ding in your car door is not affecting your windshield wipers, your lights, your ability to drive to work, totally fine, right? So you may have a mutation in a gene that is a easy to see mutation in an important gene. Your car door is an important part of your car, and yet it doesn't affect the function of the gene. So that variant of unknown significance might actually be a benign variant, an uninteresting, unrelated to your disease variant. Or if the ding hits your car door right where your handle is or your key goes in, well, you may not get the key and you may not be able to open the door. You might have to climb in through the window or from the passenger side. Now the function of your car is impaired, right? The same ding, just in a different part of the gene, a variant that occurs in a different part of the gene might be actually quite impactful. It might change the ability to use your car at all, or do you have to climb in through the window? I mean, like, you're talking about significantly changing your functionality. Those variants are pathogenic variants. They actually damage the function of the gene. They may cause your antibody deficiency, your bone marrow failure, your B cell defect, whatever it may be. So to understand when a variant lands in a gene, when it's found, what its impact is, benign or pathogenic, we don't always know. And a lot of extra testing has to be done at that point, typically in an academic research setting where people can dive into these genes and sort of peel them apart and understand their impact. It's not the kind of thing that most community doctors are going to be able to do anytime soon. And it's one of the major hurdles, as I mentioned, a grand challenge in immunology is that we have entire mailing lists now. The Clinical Immunology Society has daily mailing lists where we are inundated with these variants of unknown significance. And a bunch of us read these mailing lists and try to type answers for people, and community doctors out there try to give people hints about how they can start probing these variants, decipher whether they're benign or pathogenic. But unfortunately, this is a challenge for us, and we have to invent a whole new field, a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of training our fellows, a whole new way of building our field up around these variants, because they're coming, they're all around us, and we need to learn how to deal with them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Butte. This was really enlightening. And Abe, thank you for your presentation. Stay tuned for all the great work that Abe's going to be doing this year on our Payor efforts. So thank you.
Great news. Yes. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye.